This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host Sampath. South Korea's President Yoon Yeol was impeached last week by the country's National Assembly. His impeachment follows his sudden declaration of martial law on December 3rd, a move he was forced to withdraw in just a few hours after the parliament voted it down. Mr. Yoon's presidential powers now remain suspended while the impeachment motion goes to the Constitutional Court of the country for review and a final verdict. Mr. Yoon also faces insurrection charges for which he is under investigation. And in the interim period, Prime Minister Han Duck Soo will serve as the acting president. So, what prompted Mr. Yoon to suddenly declare martial law? And what will be the impact of all the developments succeeding this move on Korean politics and foreign relations? And what happens now as the Constitutional Court takes up his case where it is expected that he will defend himself? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Dr. Jong Lee, who teaches political science at North Greenville University in South Carolina. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to In Focus.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So, Dr. Lee, to start with, it is so rare these days to see a move like the one President Yoon made, and such a move being pushed back also by completely peaceful and completely democratic means. The Korean public did not act afraid. They were not cowed down by the martial law decree despite all the tanks rolling in and all that. So were you surprised by this kind of public reaction, immediate reaction, and also the response from the opposition to the martial law decree from President Yoon?
Thank you for the question. To begin with, I was very surprised, like most Koreans, when on December 3rd, I heard the news about my president declaring a martial law. So I was actually teaching a course on East Asian politics in the morning of December 3rd in South Carolina when my student told me, "Oh, professor, your president declared a martial law." So I was very shocked. Having said that, I was relieved that in matter of several hours, I think in 3 hours, the National Assembly, they quickly met together and they passed a resolution to rescind the president's martial law declaration. And I had two feelings. One was I predicted there was going to be a backlash, a public outcry against the martial law because we have not had martial law in South Korea for the past 45 years. Last time there was martial law was 1979. So this was not going to be accepted by the Korean public. Now,
wasn't there something in 1987 as well?
So in 1987, there was a democracy movement. Back then, the military government considered declaring a martial law, but they were eventually persuaded by the military, by the businesses, do not call martial law because we were going to have an Olympic in 1988 and the businesses were in the military government. If you hold martial law in 1987, we might not be able to organize and hold Olympic the next year. So the military government changed its mind. So it did not happen, fortunately. Now, for me, what surprised me afterward was, so there were Korean protests. As you mentioned, they were peaceful. But what I was surprised and I was amused was, in the past, Korean protests were remembered for it could become violent, or last time the South Korean president was impeached, that protests by the people were known as the candlelight protests, where people would wave candlelights. This year, there were a lot of young protesters who, instead of waving candles, they waved the LED light K-pop, those like cheer sticks. So those became the symbol of this year march rally. Young people waving K-pop cheer sticks. That was a surprise for me. A new cultural protest.
Right, absolutely a new culture. And I think neither was the martial law expected, nor was the response to it really expected by anyone. And yeah, Mr. Yoon, he's I believe he's the third South Korean president to be impeached. And of all the three, he I think is the one who has had the shortest term, just 2.5 years into his presidency. He's out of it. So how do you contextualize his entire development? I mean, we know that he's been the state prosecutor for most of his professional career, and within 1 year of entering politics he became the president, and within 2.5 years of becoming president he's out of his president's job. So everything happened so fast. So is this purely an outcome of Mr. Yoon's political inexperience or his personality, or does this entire sequence of events also point to some other undercurrents in Korean society? What is your thought on this question?
That's a good question. And I think for the past 2 weeks, like many Korean academics, I also reflect on this question on how did this happen? And thinking about President Yoon, you're correct. This is the third time a president has been impeached. The first time was President Yoon, though his impeachment was later revoked by the Constitution Court. So he stayed as president for the remainder of his term. The second impeachment by President Park Geun-hye, the Constitution Court upheld the impeachment, so she was impeached. This one, so the third case, President Yoon, I think there's two factors. One, it is true that he's new to politics. He's been a prosecutor most of his life. He never served an elected office, any previous elected office before running for president. So lack of political experience is one thing. That's one. Number two, there are criticisms even before the martial law that President Yoon is not good at compromise. Like he seemed to always hold on to his conviction, rightfully or wrongfully. He has a very specific political conviction. He will hold on to it without trying to find a common ground with the opposition. So that has been one of the criticisms on Yoon's personality. That's true. The third factor is a divided government. He may have become a president, but the National Assembly, ever since day one of his presidency, has been run by the opposition party, the main opposition party, which has never liked President Yoon. So it's always been a mutually antagonistic relationship. And it seems as if this term, President Yoon's presidency, was especially more polarizing and confrontational because President Yoon viewed the Democratic Party and its leader, Lee Jae-myung, as a corrupt, as a potential lawbreaker. So President disliked the opposition party leadership. Opposition party also viewed President Yoon with great animosity as someone who doesn't compromise and who, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but who seems to be more protective of his wife and his close affiliates despite his promise to be fair minded. So these mutual antagonism, I think, led to this year crisis, which is very unfortunate.
Right. I mean, I think you made like four very important points. One, of course, is Mr. Yoon's political inexperience. Secondly, he spoke about his inability or lack of interest in compromising. Third, of course, a divided house with the National Assembly controlled by the opposition. And fourth, I think I found it really very interesting. I mean, this entire view of the opposing your political rival as some kind of an enemy. I mean, in a democracy, they are the ones who give you political competition, which is how the entire logic of democracy functions. But to view the opposition, or for the opposition to view the incumbent government as the enemy, I think leads something which leads to a great deal of polarization, deadlock in terms of legislation, and so on and so forth. Very interesting to sort of think about this. Now, there is also, Dr. Lee, some investigations which have started against Mr. Yoon about insurrection or rebellion, which are pretty serious charges that carry the death penalty. Can you talk a little bit about what is the status of this investigation? What is the scope? Are there other senior officials also who are under the scanner?
Yes. So according to Korean constitution, for most charges, a president of South Korea cannot be investigated while in office, with one exception, which is on charge of insurrection or treason. And that's the charge that President Yoon right now faces, which grants the police, the prosecutors, and in South Korea, we have this agency called Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranked Officials, CIO, I think, Corruption Investigation Office. So that office is also now trying to investigate the president and the presidential administration. So he's facing multiple investigations.
Yesterday, there were some reports, I think, in the Korean media which say that the Corruption Investigation Office wanted to deliver a notice or a summons to Mr. Yoon, but he didn't receive them. His security guards, whatever, shoot them away, and and so on and so forth.
Correct, yes, that happened. So, so it was CIO. You may be correct. I thought it was the prosecutors, but one of them tried to enter the president's office for investigations, and they're blocked by the president's security. So they went back the first time, but they have sent notice that they're going to come back next time. And next time, it could lead to a much more physical confrontation. And the opposition members have said, if this continues, maybe the president should be immediately arrested. That's what they have warned. And they have already passed a special prosecutor law that would designate a special prosecutor to have a full authority to investigate the president and anyone involved in the charge of insurrection. So that's the law that's just been passed by the National Assembly, and the Prime Minister, the interim leader right now, he needs to sign the law right now. So that's where we are.
Right. Now, Mr. Yoon has blamed the DPK, the opposition party, and in particular its leader, Mr. Lee Jae-myung, for what he calls legislative dictatorship, quote unquote, and by which he means they are willfully blocking his budget for the next year. They're sort of impeaching his officials, blocking appointments. So to what extent do you think, Dr. Lee, this legislative dictatorship, as he calls it, was it really a factor? Was it really genuine in terms of issue based opposition by the by Mr. Lee Jae-myung, or was it like just to frustrate Mr. Yoon? They were doing this kind of blockage of his budget and so on. Was it based on political differences, or was it just to spite him, that this entire thing was done to frustrate Mr. Yoon? What is your sense?
So this is my sense. Obviously, I'm speaking for myself. Even before the martial law, South Korea was having a political crisis. In fact, the term that some academics would use is South Korea was having a crisis of vetocracy. Vetocracy, which means that the National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, would pass a law. The president would then issue a veto against that law, and it would go back and forth. So President Yoon, I believe, has vetoed for the past 2.5 years, I think 20 or more bills passed by the National Assembly. And so that has led to a gridlock between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And what the legislative branch has done is two things. Number one, they have attempted to impeach multiple cabinet ministers and prosecutors, because they felt as if the Korean prosecutors are controlled by the president and are not being fair in their investigations, especially against the opposition leader like Lee Jae-myung. So they've tried to impeach the ministers, impeach the prosecutors, threatened to impeach the judges, and December, before the martial law declaration, there was a possibility that Korean government may not be able to pass the budget in time because the president and the National Assembly could not agree on the budget. So there was a political crisis, and I think from the not just Yoon, but from the ruling party's perspective, there was a lot of anger that the opposition party was using its majority to, yes, engage in a partisan, unilateral legislative, well, dictatorship may be a strong word, but monopoly, legislative monopoly over the legal process. So there was a controversy on this issue. Yes, I agree. So my feeling was this.
Right. So
This might be controversial, but I think Yoon was right to say there was a political crisis. But my feeling was, if there was a political crisis, president should have handled political crisis in a political way. But when he tried to use the martial law, political crisis turned into a national crisis. So that was the wrong decision. Wrong move. Wrong move.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with you there, Dr. Lee. But who started this? I mean, if I may ask this kind of a maybe somewhat childish question, who started this entire veto crisis, as you put it, or a legislative dictatorship, as Mr. Yoon puts it? Was it that Mr. Yoon started vetoing every single bill, and then in response to that, the DPK started, blocking his appointments and impeaching every other cabinet member, or was it that the National Assembly was sort of vetoing his budgets and impeaching his officials and prosecutors, and in response to that, Mr. Yoon started this veto drive of his. Which who started it?
That's a good question, and I think it's almost like a chicken or the egg, right? Chicken. Who came first? I mean, I know this is going to sound very ambiguous. I think it's both of their fault because there was no honeymoon from day one. Day one, President Yoon was expressing disdain toward the opposition party. Opposition party also felt the same. I think the issue was because the last election, the outcome was so close. Like President Yoon won by 0.7%, less than 1%. So opposition party almost felt as if they could have won, but they lost so closely. So they didn't want to cooperate either. I think different series of event only escalated two sides animosity. But okay, I will give you both two different versions. If you ask Democratic Party who started it, if you ask them, they will say it's Yoon. It's Yoon's fault, the president's fault, because President Yoon allowed the prosecutors to investigate some of the charges surrounding Lee Jae-myung, the opposition party leader. So they will say Yoon was trying to engage in political attack, so he poisoned any chance of bipartisanship. That's what they would say.
Also, but
Now, of course,
also, Dr. Lee, I mean, when I read reports saying that Mr. Lee Jae-myung wanted to have a meeting with Mr. Yoon, many times he tried to meet him, but Mr. Yoon repeatedly rebuffed him, refused to meet him. But I mean, I would imagine that wanting to have a meeting is a positive kind of an initiative, and the person who's refusing to have this kind of an engagement is the one at fault.
that's a good point. Oh, so I think this goes back to President Yoon's perception. So President Yoon had a perception that as soon as Yoon was on subject to investigation, President Yoon viewed Lee Jae-myung as I can't think of the right legal term, but someone who is being investigated, being accused. So President Yoon never seemed to recognize legitimacy of Lee Jae-myung as a legitimate opposition party leader. So that was obviously first misstep in their poisoned relationship. That's one. Now, from the ruling party's perspective, they were also infuriated that from the early months of President Yoon's administration, the the opposition party would come up with different reasons to try to dismiss Yoon government ministers, and they viewed this as an attempt by the opposition party to um, stop the government from operating. So that was what Yoon felt as if that they were facing gridlock from the very early period.
Right. I mean, that's a very good point. I really appreciate that, Dr. Lim, and the fact that Mr. Yoon never really gave the legitimacy to Mr. Lee Jae-myung as the leader of the opposition. He probably saw him as someone who's under investigation, maybe a suspect in bribery charges or whatever.
Suspect, yes.
Yeah, I think that sort of explains his sort of rigidity of his position vis-a-vis this whole question of political compromise, which never happened as long as he was the president. Now, question on this entire debate about polarization in Korean society. Everybody's talking about all kinds of analysts have weighed in on this. This polarization in Korean society, which we also see in the governance side of it, as you said. I mean, if there is veto crisis happening, it is also got to do with the fact that the president is from one party and the parliament is controlled by the other party. So there is polarization clearly on political lines. But what are the fault lines of this polarization? Is it ideological? Is it class based differences? Like, what are the fault lines that are driving this polarization?
It's a good question because I think since 1987, after South Korea became democracy, a paradox was that our polarization didn't go away, it only got worse, except its characteristics, its alignment seemed to have evolved over the years. So let me explain this. So at first, our political polarization and our partisan division was based on regions. Like in South Korea, we have the southeast area and southwest area. Southeast is called Gyeongsang-do, Gyeongsang province. Southwest was called Jeolla province. And our fault line in politics was based on which region you are from. So that was the first decade of polarization, our first fault line. And then 10, 15 years have gone by, and then we had a new fault line, less based on the region and more based on age, like elderly population versus young population. Elderly population are more likely to vote for a conservative party, but younger population are going to more likely to vote for the liberal or democratic party. So less regional division, age division. That seemed to become our second fault line. And then starting 5 years ago, like this is very recent, 5 years, even 4 years ago, we now seem to have a third fault line. So not even about age anymore, but gender, based on gender, especially among the young population where young men seem to be more likely to vote for the conservative party, but young women are more likely to vote for the Liberal or Democratic Party. So first, it was regional based. Then it was age based, like generation based. Now it's gender based. So another evolution of polarization. And I think, so I've been trying to figure out like, why is it so bad right now? And my thought is, even though parties were always divided for the past 35 years, at least in the past, party leaders could make deals together. Like they might fight, but then they might have backroom deals at the very end. Like you do this, I do this, we share power. Ironically, with the social media, that's gotten even harder because now we have, I think it's similar to many Western democracies where with the coming of social media, you have a lot more like online activists, grassroots activists, your rank and file party members who are often very zealous on both sides. So hardline conservative activists, hardline liberal activists, and these activists make it very difficult even for leaders like Lee Jae-myung or Yoon Sung-yeol to make compromise. If they compromise, they will be criticized by their own hardline, your internet, social media, your street activists as traitors. And I think that pressure forces even the leaders to stay within the party's rigid stance. I think that's what's happening in Korea, United States, and other countries.
Right. I mean, absolutely true. I mean, thank you for that sort of detailed sort of explanation of how this polarization dynamic has been happening. As you said, region-wise, and it sort of evolved to age, fault line, and then gender, and then of course exacerbated by social media and social media-driven activism as well. I think it's not just restricted to Korea, as you rightly pointed out. It's there in the U.S. It's there in India too. And I think that's something which is going to be there for some time to come until people realize how to sort of handle social media in a more sane fashion. Now, Dr. Lee, we have an acting president who used to be the Prime Minister, Mr. Han Duck Soo. I was wondering, will there be any negative fallout on Korean politics or economy because of the fact that now you have an acting president? Does he enjoy all the powers of a regular president, or are his powers limited? Number one. Number two, what kind of a person is he? Is he also like a rigid kind of a mentality like Mr. Yoon had, or is he going to give Korea the kind of leadership that will be more gentler, perhaps, and will be more welcomed by the DPK and the other political actors on the scene?
To briefly give you a background about Han Duck Soo, he has an interesting background. This is actually his second time as prime minister. He was once a prime minister 17 years ago under President Roh Moo-yeon, who was the first president to be impeached, and President Roh Moo-yeon was from the Democratic Party, the current opposition party. So what's fascinating about Han Duck Soo is that he is the prime minister of a Democrat president government, and now he's a prime minister of a conservative government for the second time. And he is more of a, you might say, a technocrat, so someone he'd never served an elected office. He was always been a regular public servant, a government bureaucrat. So he's viewed as someone who is a good with administrative skills, who doesn't have a strong ideological color one way or another, but who is genuinely faithful in executing the job of an administration in service of the president of the current time, whether it's conservative or liberal. So that's his background. So in that sense, is he someone with the stability to hold the country in order during this uncertain period of political crisis? Yes, it is. But the big question is, how much power would he have? And there is some ambiguity because the Constitution does say yes, when a president is impeached or unable to hold the office, Prime Minister will serve as an acting president. That's true. So, and Prime Minister Han Duck Soo has made it clear that he is going to exercise the power to maintain political stability. But the questions now he faces, there are two questions. Number one, does an acting president have a power of veto? The opposition party said, no, you're not the president, you're just an acting president, so you do not have any veto power. That's the opposition party's perspective. Well, the ruling party and Prime Minister Han has said, no, as an acting president, I have the same legislative veto power as the president. So that's his position. So that could be an issue of confrontation. That's one. And number two, and I think this could be your next question, the judges. Does an acting president, so Prime Minister Han, does he have a power to appoint judges, especially judges to the Constitution Court that should soon begin a trial on President Yoon's impeachment? Interestingly, now the opposition party says, yes, Prime Minister Han, you have a right to appoint judges, do it quickly. And the ruling party says, no, you do not have the power. You have no power to appoint the judges. So interestingly, ruling party and opposition party have different calculations, so they are taking a very different stance on these two legal constitution ambiguity. Does the acting president have power to veto laws and appoint constitutional court judges?
Doesn't the Constitution of Korea say anything on these two questions?
They have not said on these issues. Though by precedents, so 20 years ago, when President Roh Moo-yeon, the one who was first impeached, when he was impeached and his Prime Minister Ko was serving as acting president, Prime Minister Go did veto two laws passed by National Assembly. So there is a political precedence. So I think Prime Minister Han would make an argument that previous Prime Minister who served as acting president has vetoed the laws, so I have the power. And in terms of, can a Prime Minister appoint new judges to Constitutional Court? Well, 7 years ago, when another president, when Park Geun-hye was impeached, the acting president Hwang Kyo-hwan, Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-hwan, who was serving as acting president in 2017, he appointed a new judge. So there is a political precedence that current acting President Han should have the power of veto and power to appoint judges, at least by precedence.
Right. I mean, thank you for that, Dr. Lee. Now, whatever position you might hold, I mean, the natural tendency or the common sense understanding is that you would want every power that is to be had. So, okay, you want the veto power as acting president, that's understandable. But why would you say, I don't have the power to appoint judges? Why didn't you just appoint the kind of judges you want to see in that position in the constitutional court? Why would you shy away from appointing the kind of judges you want? Isn't this the power to be used?
My guess is if you are the prime minister, so you're the acting president, yes. But I guess from the National Assembly, the calculation is depending. It's different whether you are the ruling party or the opposition party, and whether you want to fill the seats or not. So right now, so Constitution Court is supposed to have 9 judges. There's
Right.
3 vacancy. There's only 6 sitting judges. Now, here's the part that's very difficult and tricky because our Constitution says in order to impeach the president and for that decision to be upheld by the Constitution Court, minimum 6 judges have to uphold the National Assembly's decision. Right now, there's 6. So every single one of them have to say yes. Even if one of them says no, the impeachment does not get passed. So if you are the opposition party, Democratic Party, they want the prime minister to appoint the judges. Now, maybe this is the part. Maybe you got maybe some of the audience may be confused. Like, why would the opposition party want Prime Minister Han to appoint? I mean, isn't he conservative? So, way South Korean Constitutional Court works is that of the nine judges, 3 are appointed by the president. 3 are nominated by the Chief Justice of the High Court. Not Constitution Court, but the High Court's Chief Justice nominate 3 judges. And finally, the National Assembly nominate 3 judges. And the 3 vacancy, they are all seats that should be nominated by the National Assembly. So National Assembly
I see.
are going to nominate the 3 judges and tell usually the president that these are our nominee selection. Mr. President or Madam President, confirm them. That should be the procedure. So now the National Assembly is controlled by the opposition party. So opposition party said, okay, we will nominate our candidates, and Prime Minister Han, all you have to do is just say yes and confirm them so they can go to Constitutional Court and participate in the impeachment trial. That's what the opposition party said. And the ruling party is saying, no, no, no. Prime Minister Han, even if the opposition party nominate these judges, do not confirm them. You have no power because they don't want the seats to be filled.
Right, very interesting. And I mean, can the Constitutional Court or any other court or any other agency decide on this question? How will it be decided whether those 3 judges can be appointed or not appointed? Like, who decides? Is there anybody who to decide that?
That's a that's a good question. It's yet another constitutional ambiguity. I think what political crisis does is it opens up some of those gray areas in the constitution where it's not clear. So if the Prime Minister Han says, I refuse to appoint the judges nominated by the opposition party's National Assembly, what will happen? Well, the opposition party has made a threat that if you refuse to confirm our nominees, we might have to impeach you too. So, Prime Minister, you might be impeached, and then we will ask the deputy Prime Minister to be the acting president, and maybe the deputy Prime Minister will then confirm our nominees. That's what they have worked.
Okay, very interesting situation, Dr. Lee.
Yes.
Very interesting situation indeed. One last question before I let you go. So, the Constitutional Court is all set to hear Mr. Yoon's case, and I saw some media reports saying that he's an ex-state prosecutor, so he's going to defend himself on this impeachment trial. So, can you talk a little bit about how do you think the trial is going to go? I mean, they have 180 days. or maybe 90 days or 180 days to sort of deliver a verdict. And once the verdict comes out, suppose his impeachment is upheld, there are going to be elections for the presidency again. Is that how it's likely to go?
That is correct. So, based on the previous impeachment case in 2016, the National Assembly passed the impeachment motion in December. The Constitution Court reviewed the impeachment for 90 days, roughly about 3 months, and in March, they ruled in unanimous vote to uphold the impeachment vote. So President Park Geun-hye was impeached, and then 60 days later, in May, South Korea, held a new election. So on May, after the new election, President Moon Jae-in was elected and he became the next president. Now, the question then is, how long will the impeachment trial last this year, this time? The Constitution says if the National Assembly passes an impeachment motion, the Constitutional Court must make a decision either to uphold or strike down the impeachment vote of the National Assembly within 180 days, so 6 months. So they have until June, early June, to make a decision.
Early June, and until then, either the acting president or the acting president will run the show.
That is correct. So my guess is Constitutional Court doesn't want to wait 6 months. They will probably want to make a decision earlier, because early they make the decision, it at least settles this uncertainty. So there's a lot of speculations that once again the Constitutional Court will likely make its ruling sometime in March or April. That's the guess right now, speculations.
Right, March or April, I think, is when we have more clarity, and maybe the period of uncertainty comes to an end. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. It was really amazing talking to you. Such tremendous clarity about very, very complicated constitutional matters. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.